you can all hear me well. Welcome to this year's International Symposium on Borders versus Globalization, which is sponsored by the International Studies Honorary, Sigma Iota Rho, and also World, the David and Leanne Rinker Center for International Learning. We are delighted to be able to revive a tradition at Stetson that goes back to about 1960 when Sergei Zinkovsky, a professor of Russian history, was here. It was then revived itself in the 1980s, the end of the 1980s, and we're reviving it once again, and we hope that this time it will go on forever. I just want to reflect briefly on one historic moment that old-timers will remember in the International Symposium series. I think the most notable was in the early fall of 1989, when the subject of the International Symposium was the future of a divided Germany. Our participants included a representative from the East German Embassy, the West German Consulate, and Professor Jerry Huff, a specialist in Soviet politics from Duke University. Professor Huff made the then extraordinary claim that reunification of the two Germanys was imminent. The representatives of East and West Germany agreed on nothing in this session, except for the fact that this wasn't going to happen. And of course, a few weeks later, the Berlin Wall fell, and the rest is history. I don't know if we have anything quite as momentous that will occur after the talk today, but it really has been a series that's spoken to important issues, NATO expansion and other things. Well, we're excited to be able to relaunch the symposium this year with a keynote address and follow-up lecture at 2 o'clock today, and we hope you all will be able to come out for that, by Professor Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly of the University of Victoria in Canada. As one of the world's leading experts on the question of borders and the former editor of the Journal of Borderland Studies, Professor Brunet-Jailly is particularly well qualified to open a series of lectures that will stretch into the spring on borders versus globalization. His first degrees in law and then political science were from the University of Aix-Marseille and the Sorbonne, and then he spent 10 years working in the French public sector before coming to North America, where I think your first stop was in Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech to do a master's in political science. Before joining the School of Public Administration at Victoria, he taught at Notre Dame and the University of Western Ontario, where he received a PhD in 1999 with a dissertation on cross-border relations in Lille, France, and Detroit. The author of numerous works on cross-border relations and border security, Professor Brunet-Jailly currently holds the Jean Monnet Chair in European Border and Region Policy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brunet-Jailly to Stetson.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. It's a wonderful invitation. I'm delighted to be here and actually honored to have been invited to talk about borders. The first thing I should say to you, especially the students who have time, is that both lectures actually overlap a little bit. And if you're interested in border security, you should actually attend this afternoon, because this is the context, and this afternoon we're looking at data. So there'll be more precise things going on in the afternoon. It's at 2 p.m. Now, the talk is why study borders in globalization. It really is about what we know about borders and what we don't. And in a way, in this talk, I highlight what I would call a conceptual shift. Now, I don't know if you know what a concept is, but it's this, fundamental idea that we have today that borders have to do with territory. So when you think about borders today, all you think about is a map and a boundary line, and that's the way you understand them. And what I'm going to suggest is that what we're looking at today is a transition period in the history of humanity, where basically we're starting to understand that borders may actually be something else than just territorial borders. And to illustrate this, I have this first little slide here where basically I cite Jared Diamond and Norman Davis. In a way, I cite them because they are already telling us a little bit of a story. First of all, when you look at Jared Diamond, what you have here is the idea that traditional societies have a sense of territory, but you have to remember that a number of traditional societies actually were moving all the time to survive. And so even if they were people of the plains or people of the mountains or people of the rivers or the estuary, they had to move to be able to collect enough food and survive. And so the idea that a very precise boundary line is something that they had absolutely no concept of, right? They were buffer zones, they were spaces between them and others that were negotiated, and sometimes, you know, with a heavy price, such as blood, and so on and so forth. And then Norman Davis, in my mind, is probably one of the greatest historians alive today. And he's written on empire, he's written on Ireland, he's written on massive history of Europe, and so on and so forth. And you can read the citation where he basically tells us that he was born the child of an empire that basically was so large that the sun never set on any part of the empire on time. And that today, actually, when he's looking back, he realized that this idea of unlimited power and permanence was an illusion. So, food for thoughts for people who think that boundaries are always there to stay. Now, what we know, I organized my talk in these two sections. The history of borders, I'm going to take you back a few thousand years. The modern era, how we basically modernized, how we implemented, what tools we have to implement borders, how it works. And then what we don't really know, or what we are starting to understand. People like Foucault, some of the philosophers are already gone actually, but talked about discipline. And then we have idea of control, the vacillation of borders, and the idea of borders everywhere, which I will discuss. And then I'll draw lessons and conclusions. And this afternoon, I am picking up the thread in the second part of the discussion here. So, sorry about this. See, this is what's going to happen to me. There we go. You have to remind me if I forget. So the idea that borders are everywhere in conclusion, and this afternoon I'm going to pick up on discipline and control, and I will discuss some of the border policies that are known and well known often because in the media all the time. And I will show you how right now we're in an era where we are hesitating. States are doing things by trial and error. They don't really know where to go, and they're not too sure about where it's going. So, the first steps. Humans have fenced themselves from each other for centuries and millennia. It's very important to realize this. It started about 12,000 years ago. And what started us fencing ourselves and marking the ground was basically the agricultural revolution, right? When you started as a human being planting a seed, you basically have to come back to harvest. And so you mark the ground and you come back, and then you want to make sure that your labor is protected. And so civilizations started organizing themselves around this idea that territory should actually be owned. And that the first thing is to mark it. And so the first civilization that really does this is an urban civilization like ours, the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia. And the first cities in summer were cities where population lived, and we have documents that shows us that they also marked the ground. They even had wars with each other because they wanted to be able to control the territories around the cities. And so what we learn from this is that in the very early stages of the human era in which we live, right, which is the time where we settled, one of the primary ideas was that you had to identify the territory and you had to find ways to, in a way, create a repertory of the territory where you had planted seeds. And you enforce this. And so humans associate and dissociate that way. They create communities, and instead of being foraging societies that are moving all the time, for about 4,000 years, you see this process unraveling. And by about 5,000-6,000 years ago, you see the first cities, you see the first repertories, and you see this process being basically implemented through these civilizations. Interestingly enough, you have fences and walls that are appearing, and you have this idea of inclusion and exclusion. You have this idea that it's us and them. We conquer because our gods are superior. It's a process that has, in a way, reached its almost final period with your generation, because now we are looking at bordering in a different manner. And I'm going to detail this a little bit. So to illustrate what I just said, I have a set of slides here, and I show you different cities with walls, and over there you have the Adrian Wall, here you have the China Wall. Over there you have a photo of the city of Uruk, which is from 5,700 years ago. And it's this idea that, you know, I want to illustrate with you the appearance of walls, and I want you to understand why we have them. Territory is marked because we're able to fence it. Now, we don't know at that time how to picture this. Right? The idea of a map is something that comes later. But certainly we are starting to mark the ground. And the first thing we can do well is marking the ground around cities and identifying the periphery around those urban settlements. Now we have proof of this in two museums in the Western world. One is the Louvre Museum in Paris, and the other one is the one in London. On the Stele of Vulture that you have two fragments of here, you have on the right-hand side over there a description, a picture of a war between two cities under summer. And on this side, you have the writings that basically illustrate some of the ideas. The ideas is that, you know, the city of basically Lagash had a superior god, and therefore was able to win the war over a piece of land that had been farmed by its people, and it wanted to keep the land in as its own, and therefore it marked the ground and started the war, and they won because their god was superior. So you see, this is in a way a rationale that we still see today when we're thinking about religious war, ethnic war, and the dominance of groups over territory. And it's quite old, right? It's about 4,500 years old. But we haven't changed very much in a way when we look at this from this perspective. And the first map is something that comes much later in a way. What we have here is the Ptolemy map, which in this case, actually a copy from the 1700 of a map that appeared, was drafted by Greek, in the Greek civilization about 23 or 2,400 years old. So it's much more recent. And I really like this map because what you see here is the Mediterranean Sea. But you should note how imprecise the maritime boundary, the maritime coastlines are drafted. And the reason why, until the middle of the 18th century, we were unable to draft much more precise maps, is because we used the stars to actually reflect on the position of land. So one of the difficulty, obviously, for sailors, for instance, was to find their way across those maps, but also it was to use those maps as a legal document to redraft back from the map onto the land, because they were so approximate. So it was kind of disjointed between what you marked on the ground and what you could draft. And then if you had the mark on the ground move, the difficulty was to come back from the map to the ground. I'm going to illustrate this. So the first two instruments that we have, a legal agreement, and maps, are things that are quite old, and the technology has evolved in a way. If we consider a legal tool as a technology, and if we consider mapping and geography, the capacity of cartographers as a technology or a tool, we have these two instruments to basically organize our possession of the world. And these are not new ideas, you can see, and that's why I take you so far back. But on the other hand, what it tells us is that we have not innovated very much ever since, have we? In a way, you can ask yourself if we have innovated very much. The first time we use map and law together to draft a treaty is what we call the Treaty of Westphalia. It's the first international agreement where you have a multitude of kingdoms and empires, which after warring with each other for a long time, realized, thanks to, I'll come back to him in a minute, thanks to a lawyer from the Netherlands, this idea that at peace, they can be peers, and they are not enemy anymore. So if they have decided to be partners in law, they can also draft contract and agree on those. And so they bring the law and the map together to basically draft the first international legal agreement. The Peace of Westphalia is the beginning of what we call the modern era for states. It's also at that time that one of the underlying principles is that sovereignty should be the right of emperors and kings to exercise violence in their own territories without the involvement of any of their neighbors. Note that it's a top-down idea, from the king or the empress down to its people. And that's the first way we understand sovereignty, right? The legitimate exercise of violence. So the first maps that we see appearing and that are a little bit more precise, even though we're still using, generally using stars to draft them,